Mr Deputy President.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise to make a contribution in opposition to the legislation before the House, the Greyhound Racing Prohibition Bill. And let me commence at the outset of my contribution of just noting that in relation to divisions that have occurred and are likely to occur during the course of this debate, the opposition Labor Party has made informal arrangement to grant a pair to the Green Party at their request on account of the absence from this chamber of the late Dr John Kaye MLC and the fact that the party has not made a replacement. Pairing is an arrangement that occurs between the major parties, the government and the opposition. In the Australian Senate, for example, it doesn't extend to the crossbench, as I understand it, or anyone else. But the government had decided previously to grant a pair to the Green Party for Dr Kaye. But this debate has a slightly different constellation of those supporting and those opposing this government measure. And in the unusual circumstances in which this debate occurs, and for this bill only, we have entered that arrangement informally with the Green Party. Let me also say that in relation to some contributions made earlier in this debate, the Australian Labor Party opposition has committed itself to implementing, if elected to office, the state's first ever animal welfare plan. The plan, if implemented, would dramatically strengthen the welfare of domestic, agricultural and native animals across the state, and includes banning puppy factories and the sale of puppies. And of course, the Labor opposition does not and would never condone animal cruelty, and I think that is a common view across this chamber. And we can all agree that the revelations of what has occurred in sections of the greyhound racing industry falls well below the standards acceptable to a civilised society and must be improved upon. These measures, these falling short of those requisite standards, should be hit with life bans from the sport and, of course, time in prison. And we would support those approaches, but we do not support a total ban on the industry as proposed by the government. And we do understand those who come to this debate motivated primarily by concerns around animal welfare. But we think a more appropriate approach to the issue would be to put the sport on notice and to demand an action plan to implement the roadmap of recommendations, the 79 recommendations made in the Special Commission of Inquiry by the esteemed former High Court Justice, the Honourable Michael McHugh QC, rather than to take the blunt approach of a blanket wiping out of the whole industry. And we are concerned about the welfare of the animals likely to be destroyed as a result of the ban. And this is not to downplay the documented abuse of animals by the industry, but we know that animal welfare organisations, the RSPCA and animal shelters are struggling and in fact are currently unable to rehome the animals who need rehoming, not only greyhounds but including greyhounds. And given that there are up to 12,000 greyhounds engaged in this industry, an industry that, if this legislation is passed, will close in less than 1 year, I do not see how, with the greatest of goodwill, up to 12,000 animals can be satisfactory, or even a reasonable proportion of that number can be rehomed. And so this measure is likely to lead to the mass destruction of otherwise healthy animals. And we do not support that approach. And that is a symptom of this government's hurtling rush to pursue this path. We could understand an approach where the government even came to this parliament with legislation to implement the McHugh roadmap, but also to implement, as it were, the sword of Damocles, the mechanisms to close down the industry if the industry did not measure up in a reasonable period of time to the exacting standards rightly to be expected of them. And such an approach would no doubt have met with much broader support in this Parliament than the measures before the House currently do. And we think that this hurtling rush by the government will lead to consequences which will be detrimental to animal welfare in the way that I have identified. But we are also concerned by the thousands of persons whose working life and livelihoods are dependent on or substantially connected to the greyhound racing industry in New South Wales. People in every town across the state, in every region, but predominantly in rural and regional New South Wales, often in areas of disadvantage, and of course where jobs are harder to come by, that is, replacement jobs are harder to come by than in Sydney. And we think that, again, the government has not made any provision for the consequences to be visited upon persons whose livelihoods are going to be lost as a result of this legislation. And this stands in stark contrast to the approach of other state governments in New South Wales, and indeed federal governments. When the Hawke and Keating governments of the 80s and 90s reduced tariffs and engaged in significant changes to the manufacturing industry, tens of millions of dollars in job retraining and relocation for those affected adversely by these winds of change were provided to affected regions and communities, individuals and families. And when the Carr government engaged in restructuring and phasing out of the timber industry in this state in the 90s, a similar level of commitment to restructuring and transitioning of affected workforces as well as businesses was also engaged in by the government of the day. And I note the contribution of Dr Marine Faruqi earlier in this debate, where she touched on the fact that government assistance could help people transition, but there is nothing in this legislation that touches on that. In fact, the only time money is mentioned is in section 29, I believe, where it provides that compensation, broadly defined, is not payable by or on behalf of the state because of the enactment or operation of the Act or any statement or conduct relating to the enactment. But it goes further. It actually is retrospective because subsection 2 of clause 29 extends this blanket extinguishment of any compensation potentially payable to statements, conduct and other matters occurring before the commencement of the section. So the government's obviously concerned about some legacy issues perhaps created by the government itself in the way in which it's handled this issue. So we have a situation where, apart from some lip service engaged in by the government at the outset of this approach to shutting down the industry, there is no real commitment that we have seen to providing the hard dollars and cents to assist those who will lose their livelihoods. And I acknowledge the contribution of the Honourable Mark Pearson about his view about people engaged in the industry, and he's entitled to that view. But it's one thing where industries contract or become extinct because of economic forces, but when governments make deliberate decisions and thereby shut down or adversely impact whole industries, it's incumbent upon governments and parliaments to be cognizant of the human cost and to address that issue squarely and not as a sort of afterthought. On the website to do with the Special Commission of Inquiry, the government has a question and answer document in which it says, and I quote, "What support is the government providing for owners and trainers impacted by these changes?" unquote. And the answer is, quote, "The government will soon announce a detailed support package to ensure animal welfare and assist the industry in the immediate future," unquote. But there's nothing in this bill that commits the government to that course of action. There's been no statement by the government putting any dollars and cents or any scheme or arrangement on the table. So the thousands of people across this state who depend upon this industry, in whole or in part, whose livelihoods are largely dependent upon the industry and who are going to be financially impacted, perhaps standing to lose everything they have financially, this government and its members opposite remain mute on the subject. And it's a scandal that there is not one word in the bill before the House that deals with this issue. Now, estimates vary about the economic significance of the greyhound racing industry. Some estimates put forward by the Racing Industry Alliance suggest that the industry makes a $350 million gross contribution to the state economy and a $135 million net contribution to the state economy, and employs up to 10,000 persons. By any measure, even if only half right, that's a very significant financial component of the economy, and that's a very significant number of people whose livelihoods will be lost. Not merely impacted, but lost, because this industry isn't being reduced or curtailed, but it is being abolished. And this government has said nothing of any meaning to address the fears and uncertainty those families and communities are facing, and that is a scandal. Of course, estimates vary as to how many people will be directly affected by this measure. I note that there is an Office of Liquor, Gaming and Racing report in 2014 entitled A Report on the Size and Scope of the Racing Industry in New South Wales, which says that the greyhound racing industry contributes more than 2,700 full-time equivalent jobs to the New South Wales economy. And up to 64% of those jobs are in regional areas outside Sydney. But the report notes that many more people economically participate in the industry. People who work as trainers, breeders, owners, and of course those who work in a volunteer capacity. Those who work at tracks in various capacities, waiting on bars, providing hospitality, all of those cluster of support services that attend the industry. That report puts the number of people participating in the greyhound racing industry at more than 15,000 persons, of which more than 13,000 are involved in producing racing dogs. And I note that the report tabled by the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile from the New South Wales Greyhound Industry Alliance, dated 21 July 2016, puts the number of economic participants in the industry at 10,000 plus. So again, whichever number you choose, this legislation, if enacted, will directly, adversely impact the lives of those individuals and families, costing many of them, if not most, everything they have financially. And to take that step while making absolutely no provision for their economic future, for any potential safety net, for any retraining opportunities through TAFE or other service providers, to willfully take that step to economically deprive these families, regions and people of what they have without providing any alternative for them, that is a scandal in human terms. And it is a matter of record that those opposite will no doubt be cognisant of, that nearly 3/4 of participants in the industry reside in regional locations, mostly in the areas currently represented by the National Party, or should I say the Notional Party, the party that notionally represents rural and regional New South Wales. The fact is, your constituents are crying out for help, and you're taking this step to shut down their industry while providing for them no safety net. And I'm sure I'll be wrong about this because, and I know that there are some government members who are going to participate in this debate, but it is notable that to this point, apart from the Leader of the Government, whose burden it is to carry this decision of the Premier and the Deputy Premier in this place because they don't want to square up to it in the other place, at least not initially. The fact is, it is your constituents who are going to be detrimentally affected as well. And the fact is, it's not bitter.
None of what you say is true.
Well, where is it in the bill that you're making financial provision for these people?
Nowhere.
It's not in the bill.
Order,
Not in the bill.
order.
So this failure to make provision against the human cost of what you're doing is scandalous. I'm looking forward to the Minister in his reply setting out the full...
to my second readings.
Well, I did. I listened very closely, and there was nothing there about your government's financial commitment to the thousands of people who will lose their livelihoods. It needs to be in the legislation for the community to have confidence that this government will actually follow through on any statements it has made, because the statements it has made hitherto have been thin. You will assist the industry in the immediate future. Which parts of the industry? How much? What will be the criteria for gaining this assistance? Will everybody who loses out economically, people who lose everything they have, how much do they stand to gain from the government's assistance package? Will there in fact be a government assistance package? When will this be announced? These are matters that should have been thought of, that should be in the public domain, and should at least be touched on in the legislation now before the House. And the Labor opposition not only opposes the measures in the bill for the reasons I've outlined, but we have taken the step of introducing in the other place our own bill to address a number of the concerns raised by the McHugh report. And the opposition will be second reading that bill in the other place tomorrow, I believe. So we would urge the government to put some flesh on the bare bones of its commitment to those who will lose out economically. And we also note that there is community concern about the potential for a greedy land grab for the tracks that will be left unoccupied as a result of the shutdown of the industry. And I note that the Premier has said that these lands will remain in public ownership and use, and I note that the Minister for Primary Industries has said that. But again, that commitment is not in your legislation. It's not in the bill. Why is it not in the bill? Why will you not put it there? Well, I'm afraid that's not necessarily good enough for the Parliament. So these are two very significant omissions which would be very easy to address, and perhaps we should address those if we get to the committee stage on this bill. We would urge all members in this place to think seriously about the human cost of the action to be taken. We would urge you not to go down this path, but to take the more considered path recommended, in fact, by Mr McHugh QC. But if you are to take this path, you must make explicit and upfront provision against the human cost, the economic costs of the actions you will be taking. It's simply not good enough to do that. To do that simply by saying, well, we've made a promise and we'll get to that after the fact. Madam Deputy President, for all of the reasons and the concerns that I have outlined, I move that the question now before the House be amended by omitting all words after that and inserting instead, quote, "This House declines to give a second reading to the bill because A, the legislation is not in the wider public interest, because it is a disproportionate reaction to the findings of the Special Commission of Inquiry report into the Greyhound racing industry in New South Wales, and does not implement the recommendations of that inquiry. B, members of this House have not had sufficient time to read the bill and to consider its terms and possible amendments. C, the wider community, including those directly impacted by the bill, have not had sufficient time to become familiar with the terms of the legislation and to make their views on the detail of the legislation known to government and other members. And D, there is no provision for those persons and communities detrimentally financially impacted by the closure of the greyhound racing industry." Unquote. I would urge all honourable members to support the amendment to the motion now before the House.